Okay, so today we're going to tackle, a pretty big topic,
Yeah.
South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to do a deep dive on it, and
Sounds good.
it's a country that's facing, such a complex, uh, set of pressures. And
Right.
I think, for our listeners, they always want to get smart, fast on things. And so
Of course.
that's our mission today is to, extract the most important nuggets from all this data and all these insights we've gathered
Absolutely.
to look at South Africa and to really trying to understand it.
Right.
And I think the goal here is to really, understand how everything is connected.
Yeah.
The economic realities, the societal structures, the historical context. Can we even see some potential pathways forward?
Right.
So, we've got a lot of different sources here
Oh, yeah.
we're going to draw on.
Good.
And I think, something to kick us off that was just, really fascinating
Okay.
is, everyone knows that story of China, right?
Yeah.
With the incredible economic rise they've had.
Oh, it's remarkable.
Over 800 million people lifted out of poverty since the late 70s.
It's mind-boggling.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is how multifaceted their approach was.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't just about, raw economic growth.
Right.
Which obviously, was massive. They averaged over 9% after 1978.
Wow.
But at the same time, they were pouring resources into infrastructure.
Yep.
Completely overhauling their education and healthcare systems.
Yeah.
They, really strengthened their social safety net.
Right.
They implemented all these targeted policies for their poorest regions.
Mm-hmm.
They used data extensively, to understand needs.
Right.
And they had this, significant public backing.
Yeah, that's key.
And so, when you hold that picture up against South Africa's current economic picture.
Yeah, the contrast is really quite stark.
It is.
Like, for instance, the data around income tax contributions, it really highlights, I think, a key difference in economic structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking at, a progressive tax system in South Africa.
Okay.
Where they have, around 425,000 millionaires who contribute about 50% of all assessed income tax.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Is when you dig a little deeper, the concentration is even more pronounced.
Okay.
So just 2.6% of the population, which is about 1.6 million people,
Wow.
they're responsible for a staggering 76.2% of all personal income tax.
Oh, wow.
That's 641 billion rand
God.
being carried by, a relatively small group.
Yeah.
And so that kind of concentration
Yeah.
not only puts, immense pressure on that small segment of the population,
Right.
but it also makes, the entire fiscal system really vulnerable
Of course.
to any economic shifts that happen within that group.
Makes sense.
And so it really highlights, I think, this critical need for policies that broaden economic participation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So essentially, a progressive system means those with higher incomes pay a larger percentage in taxes. But the extreme concentration here raises questions about, the sustainability
Right.
and even the fairness of this model when such a small group is carrying so much of the burden.
Yeah, absolutely. And that pattern of concentration,
Right.
it isn't isolated to personal income tax either.
Right.
The corporate sector, it kind of mirrors this trend as well.
Exactly. So a tiny sliver, just 0.1% of companies.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about like 1,000 companies.
Okay.
Paying 72.3% of all company income tax.
God.
And so that kind of concentration across both individual and corporate contributions,
Yeah.
it's something to really consider.
It is. It really raises, I think, important questions about the breadth and the resilience, of the tax base.
Yeah.
And then, you factor in the significant reliance on social grants.
Right. Over 30% of the population,
Wow.
around 19.2 million people,
Okay.
are currently receiving social grants.
Yeah.
And projections suggest that that number is likely to increase. And what's particularly sobering, I think, is that this vital safety net is largely funded by roughly 12% of income taxpayers.
Okay.
So it's a very narrow base, supporting a very substantial portion of the population.
Yeah, it really underscores a potential strain on the system, doesn't it?
It does.
It brings into sharp focus the urgency of fostering, broader economic inclusion and participation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have to confront the issue of youth unemployment.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, the youth unemployment figures are truly alarming.
Yeah.
We're looking at 60.2%.
Oh, wow.
I mean, just let that number sink in for a moment.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about a statistical point here.
Right.
We're talking about a massive proportion of young people who are not actively involved in the economy.
Yeah.
And when you look at how other countries are faring,
Right.
the contrast is just stark.
Okay.
So Spain's at 26.6%, France at 20.5%.
Right.
Even places like Italy and Turkey have significantly lower rates. China, with its remarkable economic growth,
Right.
has youth unemployment around 17%.
Wow.
And then you see countries like Germany,
Yeah.
South Korea, Japan, Switzerland,
Right.
with single-digit figures.
Yeah.
So it really forces you to confront, the scale of the challenge.
It does.
In South Africa.
Yeah.
What are the potential risks? And I guess even opportunities inherent in such a narrow base, supporting so much of the economy.
Yeah.
And the social safety net.
Well, I think, it paints a picture of immense untapped potential alongside, very, very significant social risks.
Right.
And I think, Mosabudi Manjina had this really powerful observation. He said, poverty and inequality are a menacing reality in South Africa.
Yeah.
Unless the state and the citizens do something to share the fruits of the economy, things might unravel very soon. It is simply unsustainable to have wealth concentrated in the hands of a minority race, while the vast majority wallow in abject poverty.
It's a stark warning.
It is.
And, it leads us to another, I think, absolutely fundamental aspect of South Africa.
Right.
Which is, human rights and the Constitution.
Yeah.
It's easy in, established democracies, I think, to take these protections for granted.
Of course.
But it's crucial to remember, the natural rights of all South Africans had no real, consistent protection before the advent of the constitutional democracy in 1994.
Yeah, that transition was truly foundational.
It was.
Chapter 2 of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, really serves as the bedrock of the democratic dispensation. It enshrines, those fundamental rights, human dignity, equality, and freedom.
Yeah.
And, as the text itself declares, it is the cornerstone of democracy.
It is.
Firmly establishing those democratic values.
Right.
And, it's also been the basis for countless significant court rulings that have profoundly shaped the country's legal and social landscape.
It's not just about, the legal framework on paper, though, is it?
No, it's not.
It's about those, aspirational values that are so deeply embedded within it.
Absolutely.
I mean, you think about Nelson Mandela, on that historic day when the final Constitution was adopted.
Yeah.
He spoke with such power about unity and reconciliation being written into the hearts of millions of South Africans.
Right.
And this, glowing fire of our new patriotism.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just incredibly evocative language.
It is.
That speaks to such a deep desire for a unified future.
It does. And Thabo Mbeki further emphasized that sentiment, asserting that the Constitution signifies a decisive rejection of defining South African identity based on race, color, gender, or historical origins.
Right.
It was this vision to forge, a new inclusive national identity grounded in shared values.
Which brings us to Elsa Heistein's concept of constitutional patriotism.
Right.
This is the idea that national belonging isn't rooted in race or ethnicity, but rather in a shared commitment and loyalty to the Constitution, to the principles of national unity, reconciliation, and human rights that it embodies.
Exactly. The primary aim of fostering this, constitutional patriotism was to provide legitimacy to the democratic transition itself, and to cultivate that essential national unity and reconciliation needed to solidify this newly established democracy.
Right.
The thinking is that if citizens identify with the Constitution's core principles and values, and if they develop a sense of belonging based on this shared allegiance, it can effectively bridge, divisions that were historically based on ethnicity and race.
And this development of what Mandela called the new patriotism is intrinsically linked to, the perceived legitimacy and integrity of the Constitution itself.
Absolutely.
And the institution entrusted with its interpretation and enforcement. The Constitutional Court. So that underlying trust in the legal and constitutional framework is absolutely vital for this concept to take hold.
Undeniably.
And there are even significant symbolic geographical connections.
Oh, yeah.
Moving into this whole narrative.
Interesting.
So the fact that Inanda in KwaZulu-Natal is regarded as this umbilical cord,
right.
The birthplace of such important figures as Pixley Ka Isikaseme
right.
and John Langulabali Dube, and that Mandela deliberately chose to cast his very first vote in that location.
Yeah.
It all carries, considerable historical and symbolic weight.
It does.
And there's this incredibly powerful sentiment that emerges.
Yeah.
If we can co-govern with colonialists, oppressors, and racists,
wow,
surely we can negotiate and forgive our own.
It's powerful.
It speaks directly to that immense potential for overcoming internal divisions in pursuit of, a common shared future.
It's a profoundly pragmatic,
it is,
yet also deeply hopeful perspective.
Yeah.
One that squarely acknowledges the immense burdens of the past,
Mm-hmm.
while resolutely looking towards the possibility of reconciliation and a shared national identity.
So let's turn our attention now to some deeper reflections, I think, on the complexities of the past and how they continue to shape the present.
All right.
So there's this concept of mental slavery that comes up in some discussions.
Okay.
It's a way of understanding how internalized oppression can profoundly influence perception and action, almost creating this illusion of liberation, while maintaining a subtle dependence on the systems of the former oppressor.
Right.
So this concept, which is often discussed in post-colonial contexts,
Yeah.
refers to these internalized beliefs and attitudes of the oppressed.
Right.
That perpetuate their own subjugation, even after formal liberation.
Right.
So it's about the lingering psychological effects of oppression.
Yeah.
That can hinder true empowerment.
I think it's a really powerful metaphor for understanding the enduring psychological impacts of historical injustices.
Yeah.
The core idea is that genuine liberation necessitates internal development, a focus on, cultivating mindset, character, integrity, qualities that are inherently resilient and cannot be externally taken away.
Right.
And, the source material really emphasizes that unity and solidarity among those who have been oppressed are absolutely crucial for effectively, shifting power dynamics.
It brings to mind this observation from Scott Adams about governments.
Oh, yeah.
He suggests, and it's a somewhat cynical but nonetheless thought-provoking point, that even when populated by intelligent and well-meaning individuals, governmental structures can be inherently dumb by design.
Interesting.
Due to the inevitable bureaucratic inefficiencies and the ever-present dynamic of political infighting.
Oh, of course.
So, his argument is that brilliance and effective action can often be stifled by the weight of average minds and competing political interests within large organizations.
Yeah, it's a commentary, I think, on the inherent complexities of navigating large bureaucratic systems and, the potential for even the best intentions to become diluted or misdirected by the intricacies of process and the push and pull of competing agendas.
On a much more, personal and profoundly human level.
Okay.
There's this incredible experience of Bishop Malusi Mpumwana.
Right.
Even in the midst of being subjected to torture.
Yeah.
He was able to perceive the fundamental humanity of his torturers.
Wow.
Recognizing that they, too, were, in a sense, losing their own humanity.
Right.
And were in need of help to recover it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just an astonishing act of empathy in the face of unimaginable suffering.
It speaks volumes, I think, about the remarkable capacity for compassion and understanding, even when confronted with the most brutal of circumstances. Right. And it leads naturally, I think, into this crucial understanding that contrition isn't a singular event. Right. That happens once and is then finished. Right. But rather an ongoing and evolving process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the historical example of the N.G. Kirk providing the theological underpinnings for apartheid serves as a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained ideology can become within institutions.
Of course.
The crucial point being made here is that the church in this context must continually engage in repentance. And that mere apologetic words are simply not sufficient.
Right.
They must be consistently followed by concrete actions.
Right.
Genuine reconciliation.
Yeah.
Tangible redress for past injustices.
Absolutely.
And this unwavering commitment to ongoing effort. And critically, it's not up to the institution that inflicted the harm to unilaterally decide when enough has been done.
Right. That emphasis on continuous repentance and demonstrable action is vital.
Yeah.
Symbolic gestures alone,
right,
without meaningful measures to address the deep-seated injustices of apartheid, are rightly seen as insufficient.
Right.
True atonement is presented as an ongoing necessity.
Yeah.
A continuous process of acknowledging the profound impact of past wrongs and actively working to address their lingering effects until those who were harmed feel genuinely heard and witness tangible, lasting change.
It's a long and complex journey.
It is.
And the sources even touch upon the historical dynamics, among the Voortrekker leaders.
Okay.
So despite their significant internal disagreements and conflicts, they were able to unite against a perceived common enemy.
Right.
Often referred to as Diasfort Javar, a black danger.
Right.
And, furthermore, their reasons for leaving the Cape Colony were deeply rooted in their resistance to British policies, such as the abolition of slavery. And what they perceived as unacceptable limitations on their ability to acquire land.
Right.
And so it illustrates how, historical narratives and the identification of a shared adversary can really powerfully shape group identity and collective action.
Yeah, it highlights the multifaceted nature of historical motivations.
It does.
And the significant role played by both internal divisions and the perception of external threats in shaping the course of historical movement.
And bringing it down to a very practical level, and perhaps even empowering level.
Okay.
One of the sources concludes by suggesting that, that a resilient and effective solution for individuals facing these complex societal challenges is to proactively build their own businesses and accumulate wealth.
Yeah.
So this is presented as a way to gain a greater sense of personal agency and develop a capacity to navigate challenging circumstances with more autonomy.
That's a very empowering perspective.
It is.
One that places a strong emphasis on individual initiative and the pursuit of economic independence as a viable strategy for navigating and potentially overcoming systemic issues.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, we've really explored, I think, a set of deeply interconnected themes.
Right.
We've examined those stark economic disparities that continue to define South Africa.
Right.
The enduring promise and the ongoing challenges inherent in its constitutional framework.
Yeah.
And these profound reflections on the historical injustices and the long, complex journey of reconciliation that continues.
The economic realities that we've highlighted today, particularly that significant concentration of wealth and the alarmingly high levels of unemployment, especially among the youth.
Right.
As Mosibudi Manjana so clearly warned, they carry the potential for very significant societal implications if they're not addressed thoughtfully and effectively.
And the Constitution, with its Bill of Rights, stands as this, foundational document.
It does.
Holding within it the powerful aspiration for a truly unifying constitutional patriotism. This sense of shared national identity rooted in fundamental values. Rather than the divisive markers of the past.
But the profound complexities of historical legacies. And the undeniable need for continuous introspection and tangible action aimed at fostering a more equitable and just future. They remain absolutely paramount. Words and symbolic gestures alone are insufficient. What is required is an ongoing commitment to demonstrable change that addresses the root causes of inequality.
So this brings us to our final thought.
Okay.
For you to really consider, given, the significant concentration of wealth and those alarmingly high levels of unemployment, particularly among young people, existing within, this progressive framework of the Bill of Rights.
Right.
What do you believe are the most critical leverage points for fostering a truly inclusive and prosperous South Africa for all of its citizens?
That's a tough question.
It is.
A deeply complex puzzle with no easy or obvious answers. But gaining a clear understanding of these interconnected pieces is undoubtedly the essential first step.
It is. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
It was my pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Cool.